Methods are used to define the behaviors of objects. When you call a method, you're telling an object to perform an action, possibly with some parameters. A function is a piece of code that is called by name, can be passed data to operate on. All functions are methods when they are in the context of a class in object-oriented programming languages like Java. For now, you can think of methods as they are belonging to some sort of class or an object, whereas function is more standalone. A function is not part of a class or object. Anyway, the distinctions aside, let's look at a method in the context of Java and how we define it. There's method definition and method invocation. Let's look at its definition. So this is a method with a static keyword. There are two parameters, num1 and 2, and there's a certain amount of logic with the return data of type integer. So this result is of data type integer. And the way that you would invoke this method is by calling it straight with a pair of parentheses enclosing its parameters. The difference between parameters and arguments is parameters are part of your definition for the methods, whereas arguments are the actual literals that you pass into a function or a method. So parameters and arguments are not synonymous. They're basically named depending on the context in which they're invoked and passed. Let's look at the anatomy of a method more closely in the next slide. Max is the method name, and you have formal parameters. In this case, there are two, and they are of integer data type. These are primitives, integer. We also have the return type, which matches the result, and the modifier. Public means anybody would have access to this method. Static means there is only one instance. In Java, the keyword static is used to indicate that a particular member, it could be a variable or method, belongs to the class itself rather than to the instances of the class. This is the reason why when you have something that is static, you can attach a class name, let's say integer, dot its parts in method that takes strings and a whole lot of others. This parse in is a static that belongs to a class called integer. In other words, a static member can be accessed without creating an instance of the class. Let's look at method signatures. Method signature is the combination of the method name and the parameters list. In Java, a method signature is a part of the method declaration that includes the method name and the parameters list, or this formal parameters. The signature is used to uniquely identify a method within a class. The method signature does not include the return type or any throws clause. This concept is crucial for understanding method overloading, where multiple methods can have the same name, but they have different parameters list, either in type, number, or both parameters. So the components of a method signature is number one, method name, number two, parameters list. You can think of this as a fingerprint, which uniquely identifies a person. Let's take, for example, we have two methods. One is public, void, x, integer, y. And then we have another one, which is slightly different in signature, which is got the same name, but let's say integer y and integer z. So the difference being their parameters list, 1 and 2. These are actually two different methods. We also call these as method overloading. Even though they have the same name, they have different parameters list. It is important to note that the return type and the throw exceptions are not part of the method signature. So you cannot overload a method based solely on differences in return type or exceptions thrown. Just remember method name, formal parameters. Later on, when we talked about objects and OOP, object-oriented programming, method overloading is a form of polymorphism in Java, which is a core concept in object-oriented programming that allows objects to be treated as instances of their parent class rather than their actual class. Method overloading is compile time polymorphism. Sometimes they call it static polymorphism. This is a little bit advanced, but just note that what this means is during compilation, your compiler is capable of discerning the differences between the two based on their parameters list to ensure that your code, when invoking a method, it is calling the right one. For example, number 2 and not 1, based on the parameters matching. So this sort of knowing which method to use at runtime when one is invoked, when there are so many similar ones out there, is a compile time behavior. The compiler determines the correct method to call. So at runtime, your code will be able to choose the right method. Method signature is super important because it is literally a label by which your compiler will be capable of tying any method invocation to the correct destination method. We'll talk more about polymorphisms later. Let's move on to the next. Your parameters list is here. You can have 1, 2, 3, or n number of parameters in a method. There's really no limit as to how many parameters you can have in this formal parameters list. Obviously, you don't want to have a lot of parameters because it takes time to invoke them, since you have to spell out what each parameter is. That aside, let's move on to the next. Another distinction here from a formal parameter is in the actual parameter, which is what's in the invocation, we have what's called argument. So arguments and parameters are different. Arguments are the actual parameters that you pass in to a function. So these x and y typically represent a value, whereas by definition, your method signature has the definition of your parameters that includes the data types. So these are what's called parameters, and these are what we call arguments. Arguments used in method invocation, parameters used in method definition. Remember that. Let's move on. Let's talk about the return type. This is very important. Always make sure that your return value is of the type specified in your method definition. Technically, this return type does not have to be a primitive like integer. It could be a capital double. It could be a capital string. It could be any Java object that you define. Just make sure that your return data is of whichever type that is specified in your method definition. Note, your main method has a return type of void. Void simply means there's no return value. It's literally a placeholder that takes up some memory space so that your software knows there's nothing to be returned, as opposed to C, C++, where their main method returns an integer. In Java, it is void. This shall complete our introductions of methods, its definition, declarations, and invocation.